Meantime, former President Donald Trump issuing this dire warning on Truth Social in light of the two financial bank collapses. Trump posting on Truth Social, quote, "We will have a Great Depression far bigger and more powerful than that of 1929. As proof, the banks are already starting to collapse," unquote.
Our next guest writing in a Wall Street Journal op-ed saying, quote, "SVB doesn't deserve a taxpayer bailout." 2024 GOP presidential candidate here, Vivek Ramaswamy, writing that op-ed. He's joining us now live on National Report. Welcome, Vivek. Thanks for taking the time. I want to show our viewers a bit more from your Wall Street Journal op-ed, and then we'll dive into the latest. You write this: either SVB was incompetent or this is a case of moral hazard, taking excessive risk and expecting political favors and bailouts. Taxpayers shouldn't vindicate SVB's political hubris. Vivek, this morning we saw the president guaranteeing depositors will be protected. Did the Biden administration make the right move?
I think they did not. I think this is crony capitalism all the way down, because here's what happened. SVB did take excessive risk due to mismanagement. And you know who else took excessive risk? Were a bunch of tech companies in Silicon Valley that put way more money in SVB than they should have. The way capitalism works is that people are held accountable for their own decisions. But instead, you know what happened? The government stepped in to save them. And here's the dirty little secret. Silicon Valley Bank and their cronies for years argued that banks like SVB were subject to looser requirements for capital, looser risk requirements, precisely because they said, we're never going to be systemically important, so the government will never have to save us, so we get to take more risk. Well, guess what? In their hour of need, they call on the government for help anyway. And they tithe at this temple of ESG. They made a $5 billion commitment last year to sustainable and green operations for a healthier planet without focusing on a healthier balance sheet. But I'll tell you, they knew what they were doing because you know what? In their hour of need, that's the virtue signaling that ends up paying off. And while I blame Biden, this is really more of a uniparty problem. Many Republicans are also captured by the Silicon Valley donor class. And you know what? We have one set of rules for everyday Americans where we say $250,000 is the maximum. We have one set of rules then for the likes of Silicon Valley Bank. When things go wrong, those rules go out the window, and that's a problem.
Yeah, that's kind of brings me to my next point in regards to that. Management failures, sure. And you highlighted that right off the top in terms of Silicon Valley Bank and how money was handled there. The president said the same thing when he came out. But there is a $250,000 insurance limit. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And how is that tied to inflation as well? I guess getting to my direct point, is this administration at all tied, their decision-making at all tied to what we're seeing right now?
Well, it actually comes down to the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has made deep-seated mistakes in this country over the last several decades by trying to play God. The problem is they're not God, and they're playing God with a fat finger. They're not even getting it right, trying to optimize for employment and inflation. They have demonstrated themselves to be completely incapable and totally incompetent. But I also think that this should have never been the job of the Federal Reserve in the first place. So that's why one of my goals as president is to reform the Federal Reserve, to put it back to its function of restoring the dollar as a reliable unit of measurement, which is what the Federal Reserve used to do under Paul Volcker, even in the 80s and 90s, until it expanded its scope to this new mission of playing God. That's the real problem that also created a lot of these banking failures that we're seeing. And I think that's the deeper problem that a U.S. president who actually understands these issues and has constitutional conviction in them can address, but it can't just be a puppet or somebody who reads this up in a binder from policy advisors, because that swamp is part of the problem. That is a big part of why I'm running.
You know, of course, with the news last Friday and then over the weekend of these bank collapses, there were concerns about the companies which use these banks, that potentially that could lead to additional layoffs there. So it wouldn't just be the major corporations, it would also be the employees. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a myth, and don't fall for it, because you know what? These companies, if they lost balance sheet capital, especially the venture-funded companies in Silicon Valley, they can just get venture investors to put in more money to cover for that, but that involves dilution. That means they make less money if you're the founder or the CEO or an existing venture capitalist, and they don't want to do that. So they're disguising this. They're using workers as a pawn for just advancing a self-interested argument. And I just think, I mean, I lost probably a lot of Silicon Valley allies and donors over the weekend. This is going to have to be a bottom-up grassroots campaign to make up for it. That's why I said, people go to Vivek2024.com. You can learn more about this. And I don't care if it's $5. I don't care if it's $1. That's actually going to be what lifts this up, not the Silicon Valley billionaire class. And that's a big part of why much of the Republican Party itself is captured because they're dependent on that donor class.
That is Vivek Ramaswamy joining us live with his thoughts. We appreciate that, Vivek. Thank you so much for coming on.